Hello everyone, I'm Z from Susan's family. Today, I'm presenting you a vest from our Tribute to Art collection, named Picasso Sketch Vest, the straight style. For the charts of this project and knitting guidance, please search for our website by the keyword en.susuddiy.com. The vest includes the front pieces, the back piece, and the collar. Firstly, we make the front and back pieces, and join the shoulders together, then sew the sides of the pieces together. Finally, pick up stitches around the neckline to form the collar. Let's start with the back piece. The back piece is begun with a long tail cast on, then worked upwards. To make it easier, we divide the back piece into the hem, the body, the underarm, the shoulder and collar. The hem is worked evenly in stocking stitch. For the rest, knit the sides in garter stitch and the middle part in stocking stitch. The body is worked evenly. Decreases are needed for the underarms and neckline. The shoulders are shaped by short rows. It's important to know that, due to individual tension differences, the size of the fabric pieces will vary. Before starting the actual project, you should make a gauge sample to measure your tension. There's a separate video for the gauge sample. You should check the chart for more information about that. After measuring, follow the video to adjust and proceed with knitting. Don't cut the yarn for the gauge sample. After measuring, you can undo the sample and reuse the yarn. First, make the hem. We'll start with a long tail cast on. Make a slip knot. With your right hand, pick up a straight needle, or one end of a circular needle. Insert the loop. Tighten it slightly. This is the first stitch. Hold 2 strands of yarn with your left hand. Put your thumb and index finger between these 2 strands. Note: hang the yarn connecting to the skein on your index finger and the long tail on your thumb. Straighten them both. Insert the loop on your thumb from the bottom up. And pick up the yarn on your index finger from behind to front. Draw the yarn through the loop on your thumb. Release the loop on your thumb and slightly tighten the yarn. This is the second stitch. Proceed to the third one. Keep the yarn straighten. Insert the loop on your thumb from the bottom up. And pick up the yarn on your index finger from behind to front. Draw the yarn through the loop on your thumb. Release the loop on your thumb. Gently tighten. The third stitch is complete. Move on to the fourth one. First, insert the loop on your thumb. Then, pick up the yarn on your index finger. Draw it through the loop on your thumb. Release the loop on your thumb and slightly tighten. The fourth stitch is now done. Note: always hang the yarn with skein on your index finger and the reserved yarn on your thumb. Don't get them mixed up. Continue to cast on just like this. Stop when you reach the desired number. This is the long tail cast on. Once finished, let's take a look at the chart. The back piece is worked back and forth. Typically, you can follow the chart as the arrow pointed. If there's no arrow, look for the row numbers. For example, row 1 is marked on the right side, so read the chart from right to left. Row 2 is marked on the left side, so read the chart from left to right. One square represents one stitch. The white space like these indicates some omitted part. Here, the blank squares represent knit stitches. So, for row 1, we knit stitches evenly. Start working row 1. The sample here has fewer stitches. Please focus on the techniques. Hold the needle with your right hand like holding a pen. Pick up the other straight needle, or one end of the circular needle. Wrap the yarn around your right little finger once. Gently pinch the yarn with your ring and middle finger. Place this yarn between your index and middle finger. This is the proper posture for knitting. Start with the first knit stitch. The yarn should be placed behind the right needle. Then insert the right needle from left to right into the first loop. Yarn over and draw through. Release the loop from the left needle in the same time. One knit stitch is complete. Continue with another knit stitch. Insert from left to right into the loop. Yarn over and draw through. The second knit stitch is complete. You can see that, after knitting, on the side facing you, a braid-like texture forms below. If you look at the other side, horizontal lines forms below. Continue knitting evenly across this row. When knitting, the yarn stays behind the needle. I've now completed row 1. Consider the side facing us as the right side of the fabric. When the right side is facing you, the starting tail is at the lower right. Now continue with row 2. This row is worked on the wrong side. Read the chart from left to right. The chart shows all horizontal symbols, indicating purl stitches. Since we're working on the wrong side, we'll be knitting all stitches instead of purling them. Go ahead and work across this row. After a few stitches, take a look at the right side. This is the texture of purl stitches. Row 2 is now done. Garter stitch means we knit all stitches for every row, so that the texture is formed by knit stitches alternating with purl stitches, row by row. Now I've knitted a few more rows. Let's see how to count rows in garter stitch. You can count the rows after a wrong side row. Hold the piece with the right side facing you, while the starting tail at the lower right. Count any column of these horizontal lines. One horizontal line represents 2 rows. The horizontal lines here at the bottom are formed by cast on. We start counting from here. 1, 2, 3. There are 3 horizontal lines here, which means 6 rows have been knitted. Next, please follow the previous video and the chart. To finish rest of rows for the hem, you may stop when you have enough length for hem. The row numbers are for reference only. Work the last row of the hem on the wrong side. That concludes the hem. After that, continue upwards with the body. Knit all stitches for every right side row of the body. The sample is ready with row 1 here. For every wrong side row, the first and last 7 stitches are knit stitches. Therefore, you can mark the first and 7th to last stitch separately. If you don't have stitch markers, you can use safety pins or paper clips. Stitches between the markers should all be purled. Let's finish these 7 stitches first. Then move the stitch marker. Purl the stitches in between. Before purling, bring the yarn to the front of the needle. Insert the needle from right to left into the loop. Yarn over. Pull through. A purl stitch is completed. After knitting, you'll notice that on the side facing you, there are horizontal lines below the loops. On the other side, There are braids below the loops. Continue with one more purl stitch. Insert the loop like this. Yarn over. Draw through. Another purl stitch is done. Work like this. Across the loops in between. Note: keep the yarn in front of the needle. After finishing, replace the stitch marker to the right needle. The remaining 7 stitches are knit stitches. When switching between knit and purl stitches, place the yarn in the corresponding position before working, otherwise, you may have extra stitches. Before knitting, place the yarn behind the needle. Before purling, place the yarn in front of the needle. Now I've completed row 2. To make it convenient for counting rows, we can mark a loop on row 1. The loop on the needle are on row 2. The braid below the loop is on row 1. Next, follow the chart to finish the body piece. After that, continue with the underarms. For the first 2 rows, bind off at the beginning. On the right side, bind off while knitting. On the wrong side, bind off while purling. I'll show you in detail. I'll be working on this sample. We'll bind off several stitches for the beginning of row 1. Check the chart for actual data. The number of the certain symbols indicates the number of stitches to bind off. Here, 4 stitches in a row for you to bind off. You can put on a marker if there's many stitches to deal with. Let's start. The first stitch can be slipped or knitted. Here, I'm slipping this one. Then knit 1 stitch. And pass the first stitch over the second stitch. One stitch is bind off like this. Unless there are special instructions, we always knit to bind off on the right side. Now, knit 1 more stitch. And bind off. Keep going until there's 1 loop before the marker. I have 2 loops here, so I need to bind off 1 more stitch. Now, only one loop before the marker, which is the loop of fourth stitch. We need to bind off this stitch as well. Therefore, knit one more and bind off. The following stitch is the one next to the last bind off symbol. Just knit it. Note: since different patterns require different stitches, please check the chart before you do. After that, bind off the fourth stitch as well. We've bind off 4 stitches according to the chart required. Keep going according to the chart. Note: now you should start knitting from the stitch after the bind off symbol. Before you do, gently tighten this loop to prevent any noticeable holes. There's no special pattern here, we'll knit all stitches across this row. Now we've completed row 1. Continue with row 2. This row is worked on the wrong side. Again, bind off 4 stitches at the beginning. Put on a marker. Before you start. Likewise, the first stitch can be slipped or purled. Here, I'm slipping this one and purl 1 stitch. Pass the first stitch over the second stitch. One stitch is bind off like this. Continue with another purl stitch and bind off. Unless there are special instructions, we always purl to bind off on the wrong side. Keep going until there's only 1 stitch before F the marker. Bind off 1 more stitch here. Now there's only 1 stitch before the marker, which is the loop of 4th stitch. Bind off this stitch as well. So we'll purl 1 more stitch and bind off. The following stitch is the one next to the last bind off symbol. We'll be purling it on the wrong side. And bind off the 4th stitch. In actual knitting, before you work this stitch, please check the key and chart. Now we have bind off the 4 stitches on the chart. Continue following the chart. Note: you should start in the second stitch from the bind off symbol. Before you start. Before you knit, slightly tighten this loop. To prevent noticeable holes. There are no special pattern here, so we'll purl all stitches. Now we've covered row 2. The first 2 rows are done. For row 3 and the rows after it, we'll decrease 1 stitch on both sides each. We make SKP to decrease for the right side, and K2 tog to decrease for the left side. After decreasing, work evenly upwards. Let's see how to make SKP and K2 tog. First, knit 2 stitches together, also known as K2 tog. Now, the right needle goes from left to right, and through both loops. To work 1 knit stitch. The K2 tog is now complete. You can see that the left loop is above the right one. Now for the SKP. With your right needle, slip the next stitch knitwise. And then knit 1 stitch. Pass slipped stitch over, covering the knitted stitch. SKP is done. You can see that the right loop is above the left one. After finishing the underarm, continue with the shoulder and collar. For this part, you need to decrease for the neckline and shape the shoulder by short rows. Once finished, simply hold the stitches. First, let's work on the neckline and the shoulder. Please watch the video and follow the chart as you work. Here's a usual way for decreasing at the neckline. Decrease by binding off stitches to create the necessary curve. Suppose this is the neckline of the front piece. So you see, this side would be the left shoulder, and this side would be the right one. Sometimes, we do short rows for the shoulders. There are no short rows here. We'll be focused on decrease at the neckline. We'll start with the left shoulder. The stitch count in this chart is small. Please focus on the techniques. First, for row 1 of the neckline, knit 13 stitches first, according to the chart. If the stitch count is large, you can use stitch markers to separate these stitches before you work. I've already finished row 1, leaving the remaining loops on hold. Next, work row 2 on the wrong side. You'll notice that, for this row, we'll bind off 3 stitches at the beginning. You can put on a marker if there's many stitches to deal with. Now, let's bind off some stitches. Slip 1 stitch purlwise first, then purl 1 stitch. And then pass the slipped stitch over the purled one. That binds off 1 stitch. Continue to purl 1 stitch. And bind off another stitch. unless there are special instructions. On the wrong side, you'll be purling to bind off. There's one stitch left before the marker, which is the third loop. We need to bind it off. So, purl it and bind it off. For the following stitch, which is the one next to the last bind off symbol, we simply purl it. Note: since different patterns require different stitch techniques, this stitch should be worked according to the chart. After that, bind off the third stitch. Like this, the 3 stitches on the chart are bind off. Continue working according to the chart. Note: you should start in the second stitch from the bind off symbol. And before do, gently tighten this loop to prevent any obvious holes. There's no special pattern here, we'll purl all stitches. Now, we've finished row 2. And we'll move on to row 3. We'll knit all stitches according to the chart. I've already worked it. Now continue with row 4. For this row, we'll bind off 2 stitches at the beginning, just like we did for row 1. Slip 1 stitch purlwise first. Then purl 1 stitch. 1 stitch is bind off. Continue to purl 1 stitch. Another stitch is bind off. Gently tighten the loops. Now, purl all stitches, and finish row 5. Now, I've finished row 5. Continue with row 6. For this row, we'll bind off 1 stitch at the beginning, just like we did for the first stitch of row 1. After that, purl all stitches. For row 7 and row 9, knit all stitches. For row 8, we bind off 1 stitch at the beginning just like row 6. For row 10, no binding off is needed, just purl all stitches normally. Now, I've completed these 10 rows, leaving me with 6 stitches on the needle. Here is a holding mark. That means we need to hold these loops. We can use some waste yarn to secure them temporarily. If there are no special requirements, Leave about 15 centimeters tail and cut. Note to prevent the loops from slipping off. The left shoulder is done. Next, work on the right shoulder. Before you start, we need to bind off 9 stitches in the middle. You can use stitch markers to separate them. Pick up a new yarn. Make a loose knot. Slightly pull on the loop. Knit 2 stitches first. Then bind off 1 stitch. Knit 1 stitch. And bind off 1 more. When there's no special instruction, on the right side, we'll be knitting to bind off. Continue to bind off the remaining stitches. Note that when binding off the last loop, the stitch we knit, which is the stitch next to the bind off symbol. You should follow the chart for the correct stitch technique. Here, we'll be knitting it and bind off. Once done, start in the second stitch and knit across this row. Then, purl across row 2 on the wrong side. I've now completed row 2. Continue with row 3. For this row, we'll bind off 3 stitches at the beginning. You can slip 1 stitch knitwise and knit 1 stitch. Then bind off 1 stitch. Continue knitting and binding off. Now, the 3 stitches are bound off. Continue with row 3 and row 4. I've now finished row 4. For this row, we'll bind off 2 stitches at the beginning, just like we did for first 2 stitches of row 3. For row 7 and row 9, We bind off one stitch at the beginning, just like we did for first stitch of row 3. I'll finish the remaining part of the right shoulder. Now the right shoulder is done. There should also be 6 stitches left. There should also be 6 stitches left. So, we've covered decrease at the neckline. For short rows, for example, I short row 5 stitches on this side of row 1. Which means I work normally until there are 5 stitches left. Then I stop working. I've completed row 1 here. Turn. And continue with row 2. At the beginning of row 2, work 1 double stitch. No matter what stitch it is. Place the yarn above the right needle. Slip the first stitch. Then pull tight. If you are about to purl the next stitch, wrap the yarn around the needle. If you are about to knit the next stitch, just knit it as usual. I'm purling on the wrong side here. The chart requires short row by 5 stitches on this side of row 2. Which means work until there are 5 stitches left. After completing that, continue with row 3, beginning with 1 double stitch. Which means slip 1 stitch purlwise. Then pull tight. If you are about to purl the next stitch, wrap the yarn around the needle before you purl. If you are about to knit the next stitch, just knit it as usual. Here I'm knitting. Sometimes the stitches we short row for the whole section are identical, or they may vary due to the pattern or other reasons. You need to follow the chart closely. You can see that at the ending of row 3, you need to short row by 3 stitches. Note: the double stitch counts as 1 stitch here. So we should leave out these 3 stitches. Now, row 3 is complete. Row 4 also ends with short rows of 3 stitches. Likewise, this double stitch is counted as 1 stitch. After each short row, the first stitch at the beginning should be worked as a double stitch. Now, row 4 is complete. Sometimes, you need to shape the neckline while working short rows. You should follow the chart closely as you work. I'll finish the short row section in this chart. Now, I finished that. After completing the short rows, the sample is ready with third to last row of the chart. Next, we'll pick up the stitches we left before on row 9. I'll start in this side. And be knitting every stitch. For double stitches, knit it as one stitch. This side of the short rows is picked up. For the last row, we'll pick up the stitches we left before on this side. I'll be purling every stitch on the wrong side here. For double stitches, purl it as one stitch. This is how you do the short rows.